You walk into every discussion confident in your facts, yet somehow you always leave feeling defeated and frustrated. Every argument becomes a battle you can't seem to win, no matter how right you are or how much evidence you present, while others effortlessly persuade people to their side with what seems like magic. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying the art of human relations and discovered why most people lose arguments before they even begin speaking. Through my work with thousands of individuals, from factory workers to Fortune 500 executives, I learned that winning arguments has nothing to do with being right and everything to do with understanding human nature. What I'm about to share will transform how you approach every disagreement, giving you the tools to influence others while maintaining their respect and friendship. The same principles that helped millions build better relationships can turn you into someone people actually want to listen to. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing insights, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for transformation. Let me take you back to my early days as a traveling salesman in the Midwest, when I thought I had all the answers but couldn't understand why nobody wanted to buy what I was selling. I carried a briefcase full of facts, figures, and what I believed were irrefutable arguments about why my products were superior to the competition. Yet door after door slammed shut in my face, and I found myself collecting rejection letters like a man gathering evidence of his own failures. I remember one particular afternoon in Nebraska, standing on the porch of a farmer who had just told me he wasn't interested in my improved farm equipment. I had spent 20 minutes explaining the technical superiority of my machinery, showing him charts and testimonials, proving beyond any doubt that my equipment would save him time and money. The farmer listened politely, nodded occasionally, and then simply said, "Son, I appreciate the information, but I'm not buying today." I was stunned. How could he refuse something that was so obviously beneficial? I had presented him with facts, logic, and compelling evidence. In my mind, I had won the argument completely, yet I walked away empty-handed, frustrated, and increasingly convinced that farmers just didn't understand good business sense. That night, sitting in a modest boarding house, I began sorting through my collection of rejection letters, dozens of polite but firm no thank you responses that I had received over the past months. As I read through them, I started to notice a pattern. These weren't rejections of my products, they were rejections of my approach. People weren't saying my equipment was inferior, they were saying they didn't want to deal with me. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on being right, on proving the superiority of my products, that I had completely ignored the human being standing in front of me. I was treating potential customers like obstacles to overcome rather than people to understand. I was winning every logical argument and losing every sale. That's when I made my first real discovery about human nature. People don't buy products from salesmen who make them feel stupid, even if those salesmen are absolutely correct. In fact, especially if those salesmen are absolutely correct, nobody wants to feel diminished. And when you approach someone with an attitude of intellectual superiority, that's exactly what happens. I began to experiment with a different approach. Instead of launching into my prepared arguments about product superiority, I started asking questions. What challenges are you facing with your current equipment? What would make your work easier? What matters most to you when you're considering a purchase like this? The results were immediate and dramatic. When I stopped trying to win arguments and started trying to understand people, everything changed. Farmers who had been resistant to my presentations began opening up about their real concerns. They shared their frustrations, their hopes, and their genuine needs. Most importantly, they began to trust me. I discovered that the farmer in Nebraska hadn't rejected my equipment because it wasn't good enough. He had rejected it because he felt I was trying to make him feel foolish for using his current machinery. He had been farming successfully for 30 years, and my presentation had implied that he had been doing everything wrong. This experience taught me the first fundamental principle of human relations. You can't win an argument with a customer, because if you win the argument, you lose the sale. More broadly, you can't win an argument with anyone if your goal is to influence their behavior. Because the moment you make someone feel defeated, they become your opponent rather than your ally. My collection of rejection letters became my most valuable teaching tool, reminding me daily that being right and being effective are two entirely different things. My real education in human nature began when I took a position helping to resolve industrial disputes between factory workers and management. This was during a time of great labor unrest, when strikes and work stoppages were becoming increasingly common across American industry. I thought my job would be straightforward: listen to both sides, examine the facts, and help them reach logical conclusions based on evidence. I could not have been more wrong about what I was walking into. My first case involved a textile mill where workers had been complaining about unsafe working conditions for months. The factory owner had hired me to help resolve the dispute before it escalated to a full strike. I spent a week reviewing safety reports, productivity statistics, and injury records. The data painted a clear picture. The factory was operating within legal safety standards, productivity was at an all-time high, and injury rates were actually below industry averages. Armed with these facts, I called a meeting between the workers, representatives, and management. I presented my findings with charts and graphs, demonstrating that their safety concerns were not supported by objective evidence. I explained that their complaints about working conditions were contradicted by official inspection reports. I proved beyond any reasonable doubt that they were wrong. The workers listened to my presentation in complete silence. When I finished, their spokesman stood up and said, "Mr. Carnegie, you've got all the numbers right, but you don't understand what it's like to work in this place." Then they walked out, and 3 days later, the entire factory went on strike. Was baffled. How could they reject clear, documented evidence? How could they choose conflict over facts? That's when the factory owner's wife, a wise woman who had been quietly observing these negotiations, taught me something that would change my entire approach to human relations. She said, "Dale, you're trying to solve an emotional problem with logical solutions. These workers don't feel heard, they don't feel valued, and they don't feel respected. Until you address those feelings, no amount of statistics will matter." She was absolutely right. I had been so focused on the factual content of the dispute that I had completely ignored the emotional context. The workers weren't really arguing about safety statistics, they were arguing about dignity, respect, and being treated as human beings rather than production units. I went back to the workers and tried a completely different approach. Instead of presenting facts, I asked questions. Instead of proving they were wrong, I tried to understand why they felt the way they did. I discovered that while the factory might have been technically safe, it felt dangerous to the people working there every day. The managers rarely spoke to workers except to give orders or criticism. Workers felt like their concerns were dismissed without consideration. More importantly, I learned that when you tell someone their feelings are wrong, you're essentially telling them that their entire experience of reality is invalid. Even if you can prove your point with mountains of evidence, you've created an enemy rather than an ally. This experience revealed to me the fundamental truth about human nature. That would become the cornerstone of all my future work. People are not primarily logical creatures who occasionally have emotions. We are primarily emotional creatures who occasionally use logic to justify what we already feel. Every argument, every disagreement, every conflict has two levels. There's the surface level, the facts, the logic, the apparent subject matter. But underneath, there's always the emotional level, how people feel about themselves, about each other, about being respected or dismissed, about being heard or ignored. Most people spend all their energy fighting on the logical level, while completely ignoring the emotional foundation that actually determines the outcome. It's like trying to change the direction of a river by rearranging the rocks on the surface, while ignoring the powerful current flowing underneath. That textile mill dispute taught me that winning arguments and solving problems are two entirely different skills. If your goal is to prove you're right, focus on facts and logic. But if your goal is to actually change minds and influence behavior, you must begin by acknowledging and addressing the emotions that drive human decision-making. After years of observing human behavior in sales, negotiations, and industrial relations, I developed what I came to call the 9/10ths principle. I discovered that in any argument or disagreement, 9/10ths of what's really happening is emotional, and only 1/10th is actually logical. Yet most people spend 90% of their energy on that 1/10th of logic, while completely ignoring the 9/10ths of emotion that actually determines the outcome. Think of an iceberg floating in the ocean. The small portion you can see above the waterline represents the logical content of any argument of the facts, the evidence, the rational points being made. But the massive foundation beneath the surface, the part that actually determines where the iceberg goes and how it behaves, represents the emotional forces at play: pride, fear, the need to be respected, the desire to feel important, the urge to defend one's identity. I learned this principle the hard way through countless failures before I understood what was really happening in human interactions. Let me share with you a specific example that crystallized this understanding for me. I was working with a company president who was engaged in a heated dispute with his vice president over the direction of their advertising campaign. On the surface, this appeared to be a straightforward business disagreement about marketing strategy. The president favored a conservative approach based on traditional methods that had worked in the past, while the vice president advocated for a more aggressive, modern campaign. Both men came to our meeting armed with research, statistics, and compelling logical arguments. They spent an hour presenting data, citing case studies, and making rational points about market conditions and customer behavior. Each man's argument was solid, well-researched, and logically sound. Yet the more they talked, the more entrenched they became in their positions. As I listened, I realized that this wasn't really about advertising at all. The president, who had built the company from nothing, was feeling that his years of experience and proven track record were being dismissed as outdated. Every argument for the new approach felt like a personal attack on his legacy and competence. The vice president, a younger man with modern training, felt that his expertise was being undervalued and that he was being treated like a subordinate, rather than a respected partner. The logical content of their argument was about advertising, strategy, but the emotional content was about respect, recognition, and personal worth. The 9/10ths beneath the surface was driving everything, while they fought endlessly over the 1/10th above the waterline. Once I understood this dynamic, I changed my approach entirely. Instead of trying to resolve their logical disagreement about advertising, I addressed the emotional needs that were actually driving the conflict. I helped the president see that considering new approaches didn't diminish his past successes, it showed the wisdom of someone confident enough to evolve. I helped the vice president understand that honoring proven methods didn't mean his modern expertise was unwelcome. It meant building on a solid foundation. When both men felt respected and valued, they were able to collaborate on a campaign that combined the president's proven instincts with the vice president's fresh insights. The solution they developed together was better than either of their original proposals. This experience taught me that when people feel attacked, criticized, or diminished. They stop listening to logic entirely. Their emotional defenses go up, and they focus all their energy on protecting their sense of self-worth rather than evaluating the merits of different ideas. The most dangerous mistake you can make in any argument is to attack someone's logic directly, because logic is never separate from identity. When you tell someone their thinking is wrong, you're telling them that they are wrong as a person. When you prove that their position is illogical, you're implying that they are illogical. The natural human response to this kind of attack is not rational consideration. It's emotional defense. I discovered that the fastest way to end any possibility of changing someone's mind is to make them feel stupid. The moment you succeed in making someone feel foolish for their beliefs, they become your enemy rather than your student. They stop trying to learn from you and start trying to protect themselves from you. This is why the most logically sound arguments often fail completely, while approaches that seem less logical but address emotional needs can be remarkably effective. People don't change their minds because they've been proven wrong. They change their minds because they feel safe enough to consider new possibilities. Understanding the 9/10ths principle revolutionized how I approached every disagreement. Instead of preparing logical arguments, I started preparing emotional bridges. Instead of focusing on proving my point, I focused on helping the other person feel respected and valued while considering new ideas. The most profound lesson I ever learned about human nature came from an unlikely teacher, a janitor named Frank, who worked in the office building where I was conducting my early training courses. This was a man that most people barely noticed, someone whose presence was taken for granted by the executives and managers who hurried past him every day. Yet Frank taught me the secret that would become the foundation of everything I would later teach about winning people to your way of thinking. I had been working late one evening, preparing materials for a particularly challenging training session. The next day, the participants were a group of high-level executives who were known for their strong opinions and combative communication styles. I was struggling with how to help them understand that their argumentative approach was actually undermining their effectiveness as leaders. As I sat there, surrounded by notes and research, Frank came in to empty the wastebaskets. Instead of ignoring him, as most people did, I struck up a conversation. What I discovered completely changed my understanding of human motivation and influence. Frank began telling me about his work with genuine pride and enthusiasm. He explained how he had developed more efficient cleaning routines that saved time and improved results. He described his knowledge of which offices needed special attention and which executives had particular preferences for how their spaces should be maintained. He talked about the satisfaction he felt when he helped create an environment where people could do their best work. As I listened to Frank speak, I realized I was witnessing something remarkable. Here was a man whose job was often looked down upon by society, yet he had found ways to take pride in his work and see himself as an important contributor to the organization's success. More importantly, as he spoke about his work with such obvious care and expertise, I found myself genuinely respecting his knowledge and dedication. That's when the revelation hit me. Frank wasn't just telling me about cleaning techniques, he was sharing his expertise, his insights, and his professional pride. And because I was listening with genuine interest and respect, he was opening up in ways that probably rarely happened in his daily interactions with others. I began to understand that every human being, regardless of their position or circumstances, has deep knowledge about something, takes pride in some aspect of their life or work, and craves recognition for their contributions and insights. The problem is that most of us are so focused on sharing our own knowledge and proving our own importance that we miss the opportunity to discover and acknowledge the importance of others. The next day, I tried an experiment with my group of combative executives. Instead of beginning with my planned presentation about communication techniques, I started by asking each person to share something they had learned recently from someone in a position they might normally overlook: a subordinate, a service worker, or someone outside their industry. The transformation in the room was immediate and dramatic. These hard-driving, argument-prone executives began sharing stories of wisdom they had gained from receptionists, maintenance workers, junior employees, and even their own children. As they spoke, their entire demeanor changed. They became more humble, more curious, and more open to learning. One executive shared how his company's security guard had taught him about reading people's intentions and motivations. Another described learning about efficiency and time management from his housekeeper. A third talked about insights into customer service he had gained from observing a grocery store clerk. What happened next was even more remarkable. When I finally did present my communication principles, these same executives who had been prepared to argue and challenge every point instead listened with genuine interest. They asked thoughtful questions rather than making combative statements. They shared their own experiences in ways that built upon rather than contradicted what I was teaching. I realized that by first acknowledging their ability to learn from others and recognize wisdom in unexpected places, I had made them feel important and respected as human beings. This feeling of importance had dissolved their need to prove themselves through argument and opened them up to genuine learning and collaboration. This experience taught me one of the most powerful principles of human influence: the deepest craving in human nature is the desire to feel important, to feel that our thoughts, experiences, and contributions matter. When you satisfy this craving, people become amazingly cooperative and open to your ideas. When you threaten this need by making someone feel unimportant or diminished, they become defensive and resistant to everything you say. I began to understand that most arguments aren't really about the surface issues being discussed there, about the underlying question of whose ideas, whose expertise, and whose judgment will be considered important and valuable. When you approach someone with an attitude that says, "I'm right and you're wrong," you're essentially telling them that their thinking doesn't matter. The natural human response is to defend their importance by proving you wrong. But when you approach someone with genuine curiosity about their perspective, when you acknowledge their expertise and experience, when you make them feel that their thoughts and insights are valuable, they become your allies rather than your opponents. They want to share their knowledge with you, and they become open to learning from your knowledge in return. Frank the janitor taught me that every person you meet knows something you don't know, has experienced something you haven't experienced, and has insights that could benefit you if you're wise enough to discover them. When you approach every interaction with this attitude, looking for ways to learn from others rather than ways to teach them, you transform potential arguments into collaborative conversations. During my years of research into human relations, I became fascinated by the communication methods of Abraham Lincoln. As I studied his speeches, letters, and documented conversations, I discovered something that fundamentally changed how I approached disagreements with others. Lincoln had mastered perhaps the most difficult skill in human relations: how to disagree with people while actually strengthening your relationship with them. I found this particularly intriguing because Lincoln dealt with some of the most contentious issues and hostile opponents in American history. Yet he somehow maintained the respect and often the friendship of people who vehemently disagreed with his positions. How did he manage this seemingly impossible feat? The answer came to me when I discovered Lincoln's collection of what I call his unsent letters. Throughout his presidency, whenever Lincoln felt angry or frustrated with someone, he would sit down and write a scathing letter expressing all his fury and disappointment. He would pour his emotions onto paper, holding nothing back. He would write exactly what he thought about their behavior, their decisions, and their character, and then he would fold the letter, put it in his desk drawer, and never send it. I found records of dozens of these letters, passionate, eloquent expressions of anger and frustration that Lincoln wrote but never delivered. Instead, after writing these emotional letters, he would compose entirely different messages that addressed the same issues but from a completely different emotional tone. One particular example stood out to me. General George McClellan had been cautious to the point of inaction during the Civil War, repeatedly failing to pursue Confederate forces when he had clear advantages. Lincoln was furious about these missed opportunities that were prolonging the war and costing lives. In his unsent letter, Lincoln wrote with scorching criticism about McClellan's overcautious nature and his failure to seize obvious military advantages. He questioned the general's courage and commitment to ending the war quickly, but the letter he actually sent was remarkably different. He acknowledged McClellan's careful preparation and thoroughness, then gently suggested that perhaps the time had come to test whether the enemy is as strong as we have supposed. He expressed confidence in McClellan's judgment, while encouraging more decisive action. This approach fascinated me because Lincoln understood something that most people miss entirely. When you attack someone's character or judgment directly, you force them to defend themselves rather than consider your point. But when you acknowledge their strengths and frame your disagreement as a suggestion rather than a criticism, you make it possible for them to change their position without losing face. I began experimenting with Lincoln's approach in my own challenging conversations. Whenever I felt the urge to prove someone wrong or express frustration with their position, I would first write out exactly what I wanted to say, all the forceful arguments and pointed criticisms that came naturally to me. Then, I would set that aside and ask myself, how would Lincoln handle this? How could I express the same concerns, but in a way that preserved the other person's dignity and self-respect? The results were remarkable. I found that people were far more responsive to suggestions than to criticisms, more open to considering alternatives when they didn't feel attacked, and more willing to change their positions when they could do so without appearing to surrender or admit defeat. One of my most challenging applications of this principle came during a particularly heated dispute between a company owner and his son, who disagreed fundamentally about the direction of their family business. The father favored conservative, proven methods, while the son wanted to embrace new technologies and approaches. Their arguments had become so bitter and personal that they were barely speaking to each other. Each man felt that the other was threatening everything he cared about. The father saw his life's work being dismissed, while the son felt his vision and capabilities were being rejected. Using Lincoln's approach, I helped them understand that they were both trying to protect and build the same thing, successful family business, but they had different ideas about how to achieve that goal. Instead of arguing about whose approach was right, we focused on how their different strengths could complement each other. The father's experience and caution could provide stability and wisdom, while the son's innovation and energy could drive growth and adaptation. Neither approach alone was complete, but together they could create something stronger than either man could achieve independently. Lincoln taught me that the goal of any disagreement should never be to defeat the other person. It should be to find a way forward that honors both parties' core concerns and values. When you approach disagreements with this mindset, you transform adversaries into allies and turn conflicts into collaborations. The key insight from Lincoln's method is this: people can change their minds much more easily when they don't feel that changing their minds means admitting they were wrong or foolish. When you disagree with someone's position while simultaneously affirming their intelligence and good intentions, you make it psychologically safe for them to consider new possibilities. This is why Lincoln's unsent letters were so crucial to his success. By first expressing his emotional reactions privately, he was able to approach others from a calm, respectful place that invited collaboration rather than demanding surrender. When I began conducting my Dale Carnegie courses, I had the unique opportunity to observe human behavior in a controlled environment, where people were specifically trying to improve their communication skills. What I witnessed in those training rooms taught me more about the psychology of arguments and persuasion than all my previous experiences combined. I'll never forget one particular businessman named Robert, who attended my course in Chicago. He was a successful manufacturing executive who had built his company through sheer determination and what he called straight talk. Robert prided himself on his ability to cut through nonsense and tell people exactly what he thought about their ideas and performance. During our first session, Robert described an ongoing conflict he was having with his production manager, James. According to Robert, James consistently resisted new efficiency measures and seemed to prefer outdated methods even when better approaches were clearly available. Robert had been trying for months to convince James to implement changes that would obviously improve productivity and reduce costs. "I've shown him the numbers," Robert told the class. "I've explained the benefits. I've proven that the old way is inefficient, but he just won't listen to reason. Some people are too stubborn to accept facts." I asked Robert to demonstrate exactly how he had been approaching these conversations with James. He role-played his typical interaction, and immediately I could see the problem. Robert's straight-talk approach involved presenting James with evidence of inefficiency, pointing out the flaws in current methods, and essentially proving that James had been doing his job poorly for years. While Robert thought he was being helpful by sharing his insights, he was actually attacking James's competence and professional pride with every fact he presented. No wonder James was resistant. He was being told that his years of experience and expertise were worthless. I suggested that Robert try a completely different approach. Instead of proving that the current methods were wrong, what if he asked James to help him understand the current processes and identify potential improvements together? Robert was skeptical. "But I already know what needs to be changed," he said. "Why would I pretend otherwise?" This was the crucial moment where Robert and the entire class learned one of the most important principles of human influence. I explained that the goal wasn't to pretend ignorance, but to recognize that James probably had valuable insights about the current processes that Robert didn't possess. By approaching the conversation as a collaboration rather than a correction, Robert could learn from James while also sharing his own knowledge. We practiced this new approach in class, with Robert asking questions like, "James, you know these processes better than anyone. What challenges do you see with our current methods? And what ideas do you have for improving efficiency while maintaining quality?" When Robert returned to work and tried this collaborative approach, the results were immediate and dramatic. James, who had been defensive and resistant for months, suddenly became engaged and helpful. He not only embraced the efficiency improvements Robert had suggested, but he also proposed additional changes that Robert hadn't even considered. Most remarkably, James later told Robert that he had actually been thinking about many of the same improvements for some time, but he had felt that his input wasn't valued or welcome. When Robert approached him as a partner rather than a student, James was eager to share his ideas and work together on solutions. This experience taught me that resistance to new ideas is often not about the ideas themselves. It's about how those ideas are presented and whether people feel included in the process of developing and implementing them. I observed this pattern repeatedly in my training sessions. People who seemed stubborn and argumentative when their ideas were challenged or dismissed became incredibly cooperative and innovative when they felt their expertise was respected and their input was valued. Another powerful example came from a woman named Margaret, a department manager who was struggling with an employee who constantly questioned her decisions and seemed to undermine her authority in team meetings. Margaret's initial approach was to shut down these challenges by asserting her authority and making it clear that questioning her decisions was inappropriate. Through our role-playing exercises, Margaret discovered that her employee wasn't trying to undermine her. He was actually trying to be helpful by identifying potential problems and offering alternative solutions. His questions came from engagement and concern, not disrespect. But Margaret's defensive responses had created a cycle where his helpful intentions were perceived as attacks, leading to increasingly hostile interactions. When Margaret changed her approach and began responding to questions with curiosity rather than defensiveness, saying things like, "That's an interesting point. Tell me more about your concerns," instead of, "I've already decided this," her entire team dynamic transformed. The employee who had seemed difficult became one of her most valuable contributors. These training room experiences revealed to me that most workplace conflicts aren't really about competing ideas or conflicting goals. They're about people feeling heard, respected, and valued. When someone feels that their knowledge and experience are appreciated, they become amazingly willing to consider new approaches and work collaboratively toward solutions. I learned that the fastest way to end resistance is to stop creating it. When you approach disagreements with genuine curiosity about the other person's perspective, when you acknowledge their expertise and ask for their input, when you frame challenges as shared problems to solve together, you transform potential adversaries into enthusiastic allies. The training room became my laboratory for understanding that winning arguments and building relationships are not just compatible goals. They're the same goal, approached correctly. My study of ancient philosophers led me to discover one of the most powerful techniques for changing minds without creating resistance. Socrates, the great Greek philosopher, had developed a method that could lead people to completely transform their thinking while making them feel brilliant rather than defeated. I became fascinated by this approach and spent considerable time adapting it for modern disagreements and business conflicts. The genius of the Socratic method lies in a simple but profound insight. People believe their own discoveries far more readily than they believe your arguments. When you tell someone they're wrong, you're asking them to accept your authority over their own thinking. But when you ask questions that help them discover new perspectives for themselves, they feel ownership of the insights they reach. I first experimented with this approach during a particularly challenging consulting assignment with a family-owned restaurant chain. The founder, Giuseppe, was adamantly opposed to his daughter Maria's suggestion that they expand their menu to include lighter, healthier options. Giuseppe believed that their traditional Italian recipes were perfect as they were, and that changing them would betray their heritage and alienate their loyal customers. Every time Maria presented market research showing growing demand for healthier dining options, Giuseppe would counter with stories of customers who loved their traditional dishes exactly as they were. Every fact she offered was met with an equally compelling story from him. They were locked in a stalemate where each person's evidence seemed to strengthen their own position rather than bridge the gap between them. Instead of taking sides or presenting my own analysis, I decided to try the Socratic approach. I began by asking Giuseppe questions that would help him explore his own assumptions without feeling attacked. "Giuseppe," I said, "you've built this restaurant chain by understanding what your customers want, haven't you?" "Absolutely," he replied. "I've been watching my customers for 30 years. I know what they like." "And you've noticed changes in what people want over those 30 years?" He paused thoughtfully. "Well, yes. When I started, people wanted bigger portions. Now some customers seem to want smaller portions. Some ask about ingredients more than they used to. What do you think is driving those changes?" As Giuseppe began to explore this question, he started making his own discoveries about evolving customer preferences. I continued with questions like, "How do you usually decide whether to try something new in the restaurant? And what would help you feel confident that a change would strengthen rather than weaken your traditional offerings?" Through this questioning process, Giuseppe began to see that adding healthier options didn't mean abandoning traditional recipes. It meant expanding their ability to serve a broader range of customer needs. Most importantly, these insights felt like his own discoveries, rather than arguments he was being forced to accept. Maria watched this conversation with growing amazement. Later, she told me that her father had reached the same conclusions she had been trying to convince him of for months, but now he felt like the ideas were his own brilliant insights rather than challenges to his expertise. The key to effective Socratic questioning is asking questions that genuinely help people think more deeply about their own positions, rather than questions that are disguised arguments. The difference is crucial. A disguised argument question might be, "Don't you think customer preferences have changed?" This is really just a statement dressed up as a question, and people can sense the manipulation immediately. A genuine Socratic question would be, "What changes have you noticed in how customers interact with your menu over the years?" This invites genuine reflection and discovery rather than demanding agreement with a predetermined conclusion. I developed a collection of what I call discovery questions that help people explore their own thinking. What led you to that conclusion helps people examine their reasoning process. What might someone who disagrees with you be thinking? Helps people consider alternative perspectives. What would need to be true for a different approach to work? Helps people identify possibilities they hadn't considered. What concerns you most about this situation? Helps people identify their core fears and priorities. The most powerful discovery I made about Socratic questioning was that it works because it honors people's intelligence and autonomy. Instead of telling someone what to think, you're helping them think more clearly. Instead of asking them to trust your judgment, you're helping them develop confidence in their own expanded judgment. I used this approach successfully in numerous business disputes, marriage counseling sessions, and even international negotiations. In every case, the breakthrough came not when one side convinced the other, but when both sides discovered new possibilities together through thoughtful questioning. One of my most memorable successes with this method involved two business partners who were deadlocked over whether to expand their successful local business into new markets. One partner saw expansion as essential for growth, while the other saw it as a dangerous risk to their current success. Through careful questioning, I helped them discover that they actually shared the same core goal: building a sustainable, profitable business, but they had different ideas about what threatened that goal. The expansion-minded partner feared stagnation and being overtaken by competitors. The cautious partner feared overextension and losing what they had already built. Once they understood each other's underlying concerns, they were able to develop an expansion plan that addressed both sets of fears. Gradual, carefully monitored growth strategy that protected their current success while exploring new opportunities. The Socratic method taught me that the most persuasive person in any conversation is not the one with the best arguments, it's the one who asks the best questions. When you help people discover insights for themselves, they become invested in those insights in ways that no amount of external persuasion could achieve. Among all the historical figures I studied for insights into human persuasion, Benjamin Franklin provided perhaps the most practical and immediately applicable techniques. Franklin had discovered something remarkable. Certain phrases and approaches could make disagreement feel like collaboration, and opposition feel like mutual exploration of truth. I became particularly intrigued by Franklin's own account of how he had transformed himself from an argumentative young man who loved to prove others wrong into one of the most persuasive and diplomatically successful people of his era. In his autobiography, Franklin described his early tendency to be and how it was actually hurting his ability to influence others and build relationships. The turning point for Franklin came when a friend told him bluntly that his argumentative nature was making people avoid him, even when he was right about important matters. People simply didn't enjoy being around someone who constantly corrected them and proved them wrong. Regardless of how accurate his corrections might be, Franklin made a radical decision. He would completely eliminate certain words and phrases from his vocabulary and replace them with alternatives that conveyed the same information but without creating defensiveness or resentment. I decided to study Franklin's specific language choices and adapt them for modern conflicts. What I discovered was a collection of phrases that could completely change the emotional tone of any disagreement, while preserving the logical content. Franklin's most powerful technique was to begin any disagreement with phrases like, "I may be wrong about this, but it seems to me, ... or I could be mistaken, but my understanding is." These simple prefixes accomplished something magical. They removed the threat that naturally arises when someone challenges another person's thinking. When you say you're wrong about this, you're essentially attacking the other person's judgment and intelligence. But when you say, "I may be wrong about this, but I see it differently," you're inviting collaboration rather than demanding surrender. You're framing the disagreement as to people exploring different possibilities rather than one person correcting another's error. I tested this approach in a particularly challenging situation involving two department heads who had been feuding for months over resource allocation. Sarah, the marketing director, was convinced that Tom, the operations director, was being unreasonably stubborn about budget priorities. Tom believed that Sarah didn't understand the practical constraints of their business operations. Their meetings had become exercises in mutual frustration, with each person presenting increasingly detailed arguments about why the other person's position was unrealistic or misguided. The more logical and detailed their arguments became, the more entrenched they became in their opposition to each other. I suggested that Sarah try Franklin's approach in their next meeting. Instead of saying, "Tom, you're not considering the market realities," she would say, "I may be missing something about our operational constraints, but it seems to me that we're facing some market pressures that might require us to adjust our priorities." The change in tone was immediate and dramatic. Tom, instead of preparing to defend his operational perspective, found himself explaining those constraints in a collaborative way, helping Sarah understand the complexities he was dealing with. Sarah, instead of feeling like she had to prove her point, found herself genuinely learning about aspects of the business she hadn't fully understood. Franklin had discovered that the phrase, "I may be wrong," is one of the most disarming combinations of words in the English language. It immediately signals that you're not trying to dominate or diminish the other person. You're trying to understand and explore. Another of Franklin's key techniques was to replace direct contradiction with what he called indirect suggestion. Instead of saying, "That won't work because ... he would say, "Have you considered what might happen if..." Instead of "You're overlooking ... he would say, "What do you think about the possibility that these subtle changes in language transformed confrontation into collaboration?" People who might resist direct criticism often welcome the opportunity to explore hypothetical scenarios and consider alternative possibilities. I adapted Franklin's method for modern business and personal relationships, developing what I call the Franklin formula for disagreement. First, acknowledge the possibility that you might be wrong or missing something important. Second, express your different perspective as your current understanding rather than absolute truth. Third, invite the other person to help you understand their perspective more fully. Fourth, explore the implications of different viewpoints together rather than arguing about which one is correct. One of my most successful applications of this method involved a father and his adult son who were in constant conflict about the son's career choices. The father, a successful lawyer, couldn't understand why his son wanted to pursue a career in music rather than following a more traditional professional path. Their conversations always followed the same pattern. The father would present logical arguments about financial security and career stability, while the son would respond defensively about his passion and artistic integrity. Both men felt unheard and frustrated. Using Franklin's approach, the father began their next conversation with, "I may not fully understand the music industry, but I'm concerned about your long-term security." Instead of attacking his son's choices, he was expressing his care and concern while acknowledging his own limitations in understanding his son's world. This simple change opened up a completely different kind of conversation. The son, instead of feeling attacked, began explaining his perspective and his plans in ways that helped his father understand both the challenges and opportunities in his chosen field. The father, instead of feeling like he had to convince his son to change directions, found himself genuinely learning about a world he had previously dismissed. Franklin's method taught me that the words we choose don't just convey information, they create the emotional context that determines whether that information will be received openly or defensively. When you approach disagreement with humility and curiosity rather than certainty and authority, you invite collaboration rather than resistance. Growing up as the son of a poor Scottish farmer who came to America seeking opportunity, I witnessed firsthand the industrial conflicts that would shape my understanding of human relations for the rest of my life. My family's connection to the steel industry, though we shared no relation to Andrew Carnegie despite our common surname, gave me early exposure to the tensions between workers and management that were defining American industry. The steel mills of Pennsylvania were cauldrons of human emotion disguised as economic disputes. What appeared on the surface to be arguments about wages, working conditions, and productivity were actually deeper conflicts about dignity, respect, and the fundamental question of how human beings should treat each other in the pursuit of profit and progress. I remember vividly the stories my father would tell about the great steel strikes, particularly the Homestead Strike of 1892. While the newspapers portrayed this as a simple labor dispute about wage cuts, my father helped me understand that the real issue was much more complex and fundamentally human. The workers weren't just angry about money. They were angry about being treated as expendable resources rather than valuable human beings. The managers weren't just focused on profits. They were under enormous pressure to remain competitive in a rapidly changing industry. Both sides had legitimate concerns, but they had become so focused on proving each other wrong that they had lost sight of their shared interest in the success of the company and the community. What fascinated me most about these industrial conflicts was how quickly economic arguments became personal attacks. Discussions about productivity would turn into accusations about laziness. Conversations about wages would become arguments about greed. Debates about working conditions would escalate into questions about basic human worth and dignity. I began to see a pattern that would influence all my later work in human relations. When people feel that their fundamental worth is being questioned, they stop thinking rationally about solutions and start thinking emotionally about survival. The moment a disagreement becomes a threat to someone's sense of identity and value, it transforms from a problem to be solved into a battle to be won. One story my father told me had a particularly profound impact on my thinking. During a particularly tense period at a local mill, a young foreman named Patrick was struggling with a group of experienced workers who seemed to resist every suggestion he made for improving efficiency. The workers viewed Patrick as an outsider who didn't understand their work, while Patrick saw them as stubborn and resistant to obviously beneficial changes. The conflict escalated until the mill superintendent, a wise man named McConnell, intervened. Instead of taking sides or issuing orders, McConnell did something unexpected. He arranged for Patrick to spend a week working alongside the experienced workers, learning their jobs from the ground up. During that week, Patrick discovered that many of his obviously beneficial changes would actually create safety hazards that he hadn't anticipated. The workers, meanwhile, came to understand that Patrick's suggestions, while sometimes impractical in their original form, were based on genuine insights about efficiency that could be adapted to work safely. By the end of the week, Patrick and the workers had developed a modified approach that incorporated the best ideas from both sides. More importantly, they had developed mutual respect based on understanding each other's expertise and concerns. This story taught me that most workplace conflicts aren't really about competing ideas. They're about people feeling that their knowledge and experience are being dismissed or undervalued. When Patrick approached the workers as a student rather than a teacher, when he demonstrated respect for their expertise while sharing his own insights, the resistance disappeared and collaboration emerged. I saw this pattern repeated countless times throughout the industrial communities of my youth. The managers who were most successful at implementing changes were not necessarily those with the best ideas, but those who were best at making workers feel that their input was valued and their concerns were heard. Conversely, the managers who struggled most were often those who had excellent technical knowledge, but who approached workers with an attitude that said, "I know better than you do," even when they were correct about the technical aspects of their proposals. They failed because they made people feel diminished and defensive. These early observations taught me that winning arguments and solving problems are two entirely different skills. If your goal is to prove that you're smarter or more knowledgeable than someone else, focus on being right. But if your goal is to actually improve conditions and achieve better results, focus on making the other person feel respected and valued while you work together toward solutions. The steel industry conflicts of my youth showed me that behind every economic dispute, every workplace disagreement, every argument about policies and procedures, there are human beings who want to feel that their contributions matter and their dignity is respected. When you address those deeper human needs, you create the foundation for resolving almost any surface-level disagreement. This understanding would become the cornerstone of everything I would later teach about human relations. People don't resist ideas that make them feel important and respected, but they will fight fiercely against ideas that make them feel diminished or unvalued, no matter how logical or beneficial those ideas might be. After years of studying human behavior, observing countless conflicts, and testing different approaches to disagreement, I distilled my understanding into 3 fundamental techniques that form the foundation of all successful persuasion. These aren't just communication tactics, they're a complete philosophy for transforming adversarial relationships into collaborative ones. The first technique is perhaps the most counterintuitive. The only way to win an argument is to avoid it entirely. This doesn't mean backing down from important discussions or failing to express your views. It means recognizing that the moment a conversation becomes an argument, a contest to see who can prove the other person wrong, both parties have already lost the opportunity for genuine influence and understanding. I learned this principle through painful experience early in my career. I was consulting with a company where the sales manager and the production manager were engaged in a bitter dispute about delivery schedules. The sales manager insisted that faster delivery times were essential for customer satisfaction, while the production manager maintained that quality required adequate manufacturing time. Initially, I tried to help them resolve their argument by examining the facts and finding a logical compromise. But the more we focused on who was right about delivery times and quality standards, the more entrenched they became in their positions. Each man gathered more evidence to support his view and more ammunition to attack the other's position. That's when I realized we were approaching the problem entirely wrong. This wasn't really an argument about delivery schedules. It was 2 professionals who both cared deeply about the company's success but had different perspectives on how to achieve it. The sales manager's concern for customer satisfaction and the production manager's commitment to quality were both valuable contributions to the company's mission. Instead of trying to determine who was right, I helped them recognize their shared goal and explore how their different priorities could work together rather than against each other. When we stopped arguing about whose approach was correct and started collaborating on how to achieve both excellent quality and customer satisfaction, they quickly developed solutions that neither had considered while they were focused on proving each other wrong. The second fundamental technique is to show respect for the other person's opinion, even when you disagree completely. This doesn't mean pretending to agree when you don't. It means acknowledging that reasonable, intelligent people can look at the same situation and reach different conclusions based on their experience, values, and priorities. Most people approach disagreement with the assumption that if someone disagrees with them, that person must be either uninformed or unreasonable. This assumption immediately creates hostility because it implies that the other person is somehow deficient in intelligence or character. But when you approach disagreement with genuine curiosity about how an intelligent person could reach a different conclusion, you create space for understanding and learning. You might say something like, "I can see why someone with your experience would view it that way," or "That's an interesting perspective. Help me understand your reasoning." I discovered this technique's power during a particularly challenging mediation between a traditional family business owner and his daughter, who wanted to modernize their operations. The father saw his daughter's proposals as a rejection of everything he had built, while the daughter saw her father's resistance as stubborn attachment to outdated methods. When I helped each of them articulate respect for the other's perspective, the father acknowledging his daughter's business, education, and fresh insights, the daughter recognizing her father's proven track record and deep industry knowledge, they were able to have an entirely different kind of conversation. Instead of each trying to prove the other wrong, they began exploring how to honor the company's heritage while adapting to changing market conditions. The third fundamental technique is to begin every difficult conversation in a friendly way. This might seem obvious, but most people do exactly the opposite when they're preparing to disagree with someone. They steel themselves for battle, adopt a serious or stern tone, and approach the other person as an adversary to be defeated rather than a human being to be understood. The emotional tone you establish in the first few moments of any conversation determines everything that follows. If you begin with warmth and genuine interest in the other person, you create an atmosphere where disagreement can feel like collaborative problem solving. If you begin with coldness or formality, you signal that this is going to be a contest rather than a conversation. I learned this lesson from watching a master negotiator handle what should have been an explosive confrontation between union representatives and company management. Instead of beginning with the contentious issues, he started by acknowledging the good faith efforts both sides had made, expressing appreciation for everyone's willingness to meet, and emphasizing their shared interest in the company's success and the workers' welfare. By the time they got to the difficult issues, they were talking to each other as partners facing a common challenge rather than enemies fighting for victory. The same facts that might have led to an adversarial argument instead became elements of a collaborative solution. These three techniques work together to create what I call the persuasion triangle: avoid argument, respect opinions, and begin friendly. When you apply all three consistently, you transform the entire dynamic of disagreement. Instead of creating resistance, you create openness. Instead of triggering defensiveness, you encourage collaboration. Instead of making people want to prove you wrong, you make them want to work with you toward mutual understanding. The key insight behind all three techniques is that people's emotional state determines their receptiveness to new ideas, far more than the logical merit of those ideas. When someone feels attacked, dismissed, or disrespected, they become psychologically incapable of considering your perspective objectively. But when they feel heard, valued, and treated with genuine warmth, they become remarkably open to exploring new possibilities. I've seen these three techniques transform the most hostile disagreements into productive collaborations, turn bitter enemies into trusted allies, and convert the most stubborn opponents into enthusiastic supporters. They work because they address the fundamental human needs that drive all our interactions: the need to feel respected, understood, and valued as a person. One of the most counterintuitive discoveries I made about human influence came during a crisis in my own career that could have destroyed my reputation and livelihood. I had made a serious error in a training program I was conducting for a major corporation, giving advice that led to significant problems for several participants. When the mistakes became apparent, I faced a choice that would define not only how this crisis was resolved, but how I would approach all future conflicts. My natural instinct was to defend myself, to explain the circumstances that led to the error, to minimize the impact of my mistake, and to shift attention to factors beyond my control. This is what most people do when they're caught in a mistake. They fight to preserve their image and protect their ego, even when doing so makes the situation worse. But something made me pause and consider a different approach. What if, instead of defending my mistake, I acknowledged it completely and took full responsibility for the consequences? What if I demonstrated the kind of intellectual honesty and personal accountability that I hoped to see in others? I called a meeting with all the affected parties and began with words that felt terrifying to say. I made a serious error in judgment, and I take full responsibility for the problems this has caused. I didn't offer excuses, didn't blame circumstances, didn't try to minimize the impact. I simply acknowledged the mistake and focused entirely on how we could address the consequences and prevent similar problems in the future. The response was completely unexpected. Instead of attacking me or withdrawing their confidence, the people affected by my mistake became my strongest allies in finding solutions. They offered insights and assistance that helped resolve the problems more quickly and effectively than I could have managed alone. Most remarkably, several of them later told me that my willingness to admit the mistake had actually increased their respect for me rather than diminishing it. This experience taught me one of the most powerful principles of human relations. Admitting your mistakes doesn't make you appear weak, it makes you appear strong enough to handle the truth. When you acknowledge an error honestly and completely, you demonstrate the kind of character and integrity that people admire and trust. More importantly, admitting mistakes has an almost magical effect on other people's willingness to admit their own mistakes and work collaboratively toward solutions. When someone sees you being vulnerable and honest about your failures, they feel safe being vulnerable and honest about theirs. I began experimenting with this principle in my consulting work and discovered that it could transform even the most hostile and defensive situations. I was working with a company where the CEO and his board of directors were locked in a bitter conflict about strategic direction. Both sides had made mistakes in their approach to the dispute, but neither was willing to acknowledge any fault. For fear of appearing weak or incompetent, the breakthrough came when I convinced the CEO to begin their next board meeting by acknowledging specific mistakes he had made in how he had handled the situation. I realize I've been defensive about your concerns instead of listening to them, he said. I've also failed to communicate my reasoning clearly, which has led to misunderstandings about my intentions. The effect on the board was immediate and dramatic. Instead of continuing their attack, they began acknowledging their own mistakes in how they had approached the conflict. Within an hour, they had moved from mutual recrimination to collaborative problem-solving, with both sides working together to address the strategic challenges facing the company. I discovered that admitting mistakes works so powerfully because it addresses one of the deepest psychological needs in human conflict: the need to feel heard and validated. When someone is angry with you about a mistake you've made, what they usually want more than anything else is for you to acknowledge the impact of your error and take responsibility for it. Most people, when confronted with their mistakes, immediately begin defending and explaining rather than acknowledging and apologizing. This creates a cycle where the other person feels unheard and keeps escalating their criticism in an attempt to get recognition of the problem. But when you acknowledge the mistake fully and sincerely, you remove the need for them to keep fighting to be heard. I learned to distinguish between different types of admissions that have very different effects on other people. A defensive admission sounds like, I may have made some mistakes, but you have to understand the circumstances I was dealing with. This actually makes the situation worse because it appears to take responsibility while actually deflecting it. A powerful admission sounds like, I made a mistake, and I understand how that affected you. I take full responsibility for the consequences, and I want to focus on how we can address this situation going forward. This type of admission creates trust and opens the door to collaborative solutions. One of my most memorable applications of this principle involved a family business where the father and son were in constant conflict. The son had made several expensive mistakes in his first year of taking on significant responsibilities, and the father had responded with increasingly harsh criticism and micromanagement. When I suggested that the father begin their next conversation by acknowledging his own mistakes in how he had handled the situation, he was resistant. But he's the one who made the business mistakes, he argued. Why should I apologize? I explained that acknowledging his mistakes in communication and management style didn't excuse his son's business errors. It created the emotional safety necessary for his son to honestly examine and learn from those errors. When people feel attacked and defensive, they can't think clearly about their mistakes or how to avoid them in the future. The father eventually agreed to try this approach. He began their next conversation by saying, "Son, I've been so focused on your mistakes that I've made some serious mistakes of my own. I've been critical instead of supportive, and I've been managing you instead of mentoring you. I realize this has made it harder for you to learn and grow." The son's response was remarkable. Instead of becoming defensive about his business mistakes, he began openly discussing what he had learned from them and asking for guidance on how to handle similar situations in the future. The father's willingness to acknowledge his own mistakes had created the emotional safety necessary for genuine learning and growth to occur. Admitting mistakes became one of my most reliable tools for transforming conflict into collaboration, defensiveness into openness, and enemies into allies. During my years of public speaking and training, I discovered that the human mind responds far more powerfully to vivid, concrete experiences than to abstract arguments or statistical evidence. People might forget your statistics, but they will remember your stories. They might question your logic, but they will be moved by your demonstrations. This led me to develop what I call the dramatization principle, the art of making your ideas come alive through vivid presentation. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging training session with a group of insurance salesmen who were struggling to convince potential customers about the importance of life insurance. These men knew all the statistics about mortality rates, understood the financial mathematics of insurance policies, and could present logical arguments about financial security, yet they were failing to persuade people to actually purchase insurance. I watched several of them practice their sales presentations, and the problem became clear immediately. They were treating life insurance as an abstract financial product rather than a concrete solution to real human concerns. They spoke about actuarial tables and premium structures when they should have been talking about children's education and family security. I decided to try an experiment. Instead of having them present statistics about the probability of premature death I asked one salesman to tell the story of a specific family he knew who had faced exactly this situation. Instead of discussing adequate coverage amounts, I had him describe what it would mean for his own children if he were no longer able to provide for them. The transformation was immediate and powerful. When the salesman spoke from personal experience and painted vivid pictures of real consequences, everyone in the room was engaged in a way they hadn't been during the statistical presentations. The abstract concept of life insurance became the concrete reality of protecting the people you love most. I began incorporating this principle into all my training programs, teaching people to replace abstract arguments with concrete stories, to substitute vivid demonstrations for statistical evidence, and to make their ideas tangible rather than theoretical. One of my most memorable applications of this principle involved a factory manager who was struggling to convince his workers to follow new safety procedures. He had tried posting safety statistics, giving lectures about accident rates, and explaining the logical reasons for the new protocols. The workers listened politely but continued following their familiar routines. The breakthrough came when I suggested that instead of talking about safety statistics, he should dramatize the real consequences of workplace accidents. He arranged for a worker who had been injured in a preventable accident to speak to the group about his experience, not just the physical pain, but the impact on his family, his lost wages, and his ongoing struggles with disability. Then, instead of simply explaining the new safety procedures, the manager demonstrated them, showing exactly how each protocol could prevent the kind of accident they had just heard described. He made the abstract concept of workplace safety into a concrete, personal reality that every worker could understand and relate to. The result was immediate and lasting. Workers who had been resistant to change began following the new procedures. Without further persuasion, they had experienced, through the dramatization, why these changes mattered in ways that no amount of statistical evidence could have conveyed. Learn that dramatization works so powerfully because it engages people's emotions and imagination in addition to their rational thinking. When you tell someone that accidents happen in 2.3% of cases, you're giving them information to think about. But when you help them visualize what it would feel like to call their spouse from a hospital emergency room, you're giving them an experience that moves them to action. The key to effective dramatization is making abstract concepts concrete and personal. Instead of talking about improved efficiency, show exactly what an extra hour of family time would mean. Instead of discussing market opportunities, paint a picture of the specific customers who are waiting for your solution. Instead of presenting cost savings, demonstrate what those savings could purchase that matters to people's lives. I developed several techniques for incorporating dramatization into difficult conversations and negotiations. One of the most effective was what I called the empty chair technique. When trying to help feuding parties understand each other's perspectives, I would place an empty chair in the room and ask each person to sit in it while describing the situation from their opponent's point of view. This simple physical dramatization forced people to literally see the conflict from a different angle. It was much more powerful than simply asking them to consider the other perspective because it created a concrete, physical experience of shifting viewpoints. Another technique I used frequently was the future scenario dramatization. Instead of arguing about whether a proposed change would be beneficial, I would ask people to imagine themselves 1 year in the future, describing how the change had affected their daily work or personal life. This helped them experience the potential consequences of different decisions rather than just analyzing them intellectually. One particularly successful application involved a married couple who were constantly arguing about financial decisions. Instead of trying to resolve their disagreements through logical discussion of budgets and priorities, I asked them to dramatize their different approaches by role-playing conversations with their adult children 20 years in the future, when the husband played the role of explaining to his grown children why the family had always struggled financially because they never saved money, and the wife played the role of explaining why the family had missed important experiences because they were always worried about saving for the future. Both of them gained new understanding of their partner's perspective. The dramatization helped them see that they weren't really arguing about money. They were expressing different values about security versus experience, different fears about the future, and different ideas about what would make their family happy. Once they understood these deeper concerns, they were able to develop financial plans that honored both of their core values. Dramatization taught me that the most persuasive arguments are not arguments at all, they're experiences that help people feel the truth of your perspective rather than just understand it intellectually. When you can make your ideas come alive through vivid presentation, you transform abstract disagreement into shared human experience. One of the most profound insights I gained about human motivation came from observing the difference between how people respond to commands versus challenges. When you tell someone what they must do, you often trigger resistance, even when they agree with the goal. But when you challenge someone to achieve something meaningful, you tap into their deepest drives for accomplishment and recognition. This discovery emerged from my work with a particularly struggling sales team whose manager, Richard, was frustrated by his team's poor performance. Richard's approach was to issue increasingly detailed instructions about how his salespeople should conduct their calls, follow up with prospects, and close deals. The more specific his commands became, the more his teams seemed to resist and underperform. I observed several of Richard's team meetings and noticed an interesting pattern. Whenever he gave direct orders, you need to make 20 calls per day or you must follow up within 24 hours. The salespeople would nod politely but show little enthusiasm. Their body language suggested compliance rather than commitment. I suggested that Richard try a completely different approach in his next team meeting. Instead of telling his team what they had to do, he presented them with a challenge that appealed to their pride and competitive spirit. "I've been thinking about our team's potential," Richard began, "and I believe we have the talent to become the top-performing sales division in the company. The question is whether we're willing to do what it takes to prove that we're capable of extraordinary results." The change in the room was immediate. Instead of the resigned acceptance I had observed during his previous directive meetings, I saw genuine interest and engagement. Richard continued by describing the specific goals that would demonstrate their excellence, but he presented these as challenges to be conquered rather than requirements to be fulfilled. "I'm not going to tell you how to achieve these results," he said. "You know your customers better than I do, and you understand what approaches work best for you. What I'm asking is whether you're willing to commit to proving that this team can achieve something remarkable." The response was extraordinary. The same salespeople who had been resistant to Richard's detailed instructions became enthusiastic about developing their own strategies for meeting the challenge. They began collaborating on innovative approaches, sharing successful techniques, and holding each other accountable for their commitments. Within 3 months, they had indeed become the top-performing sales division in the company. But more importantly, they had transformed from a group of people following orders into a team of professionals pursuing excellence. This experience taught me that the fundamental difference between a command and a challenge lies in where it places the source of motivation. A command says, "Do this because I'm telling you to." A challenge says, "Achieve this because you're capable of greatness." Commands appeal to people's sense of duty and compliance, which can be effective in the short term but often creates resentment and minimum effort. Challenges appeal to people's sense of pride and accomplishment, which creates sustained motivation and maximum effort. I began incorporating this principle into support all kinds of difficult conversations and negotiations. Instead of telling people what they should do, I learned to frame requests as opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities and character. For example, instead of saying, "You need to improve your punctuality," I would say, "I have confidence that you can set an example for the team by showing that excellence includes reliability in all areas." Instead of "You must reduce your expenses," I would say, "I'm curious whether you can find creative ways to achieve our goals, while also being a good steward of company resources." The challenge approach works because it honors people's autonomy, while appealing to their desire to prove themselves capable of meeting high standards. When you challenge someone, you're expressing confidence in their abilities rather than doubt about their current performance. One of my most successful applications of this principle involved a father who was struggling with his teenager's poor academic performance. The traditional approach of punishments and commands had only created more conflict and resistance. I suggested that instead of focusing on what his son was doing wrong, he framed the situation as a challenge that would demonstrate the young man's true capabilities. "Son," he said during their next conversation, "I've been thinking about your potential, and I believe you're capable of academic success. That would surprise even you. The question is whether you're interested in discovering just how capable you really are." This approach completely changed the dynamic of their relationship. Instead of feeling criticized and controlled, the teenager felt respected and challenged. He began approaching his studies not to avoid punishment, but to prove his father's confidence in him was justified. The challenge principle also proved invaluable in business negotiations. Instead of trying to pressure people into accepting my proposals, I learned to challenge them to find solutions that would benefit everyone involved. "I have a feeling that between your expertise and mine, we can develop an approach that exceeds both of our initial expectations," I would say. "Are you interested in exploring whether we can create something better than either of us imagined on our own?" This framing transformed adversarial negotiations into collaborative problem-solving sessions. People who might have resisted my direct proposals became enthusiastic about the challenge of developing superior solutions together. I discovered that the most powerful challenges are those that appeal to people's highest values and aspirations. Instead of challenging someone to beat their competition, challenge them to set a new standard of excellence. Instead of challenging them to make more money, challenge them to create value that improves people's lives. The key insight behind the challenge principle is that people don't resist opportunities to prove their worth and demonstrate their capabilities. They resist being told what to do, but they embrace invitations to show what they can accomplish. When you present difficulties as challenges rather than problems, when you frame requests as opportunities rather than obligations, when you appeal to people's potential rather than criticizing their current performance, you tap into their deepest motivations for achievement and recognition. The rise of written communication through email, text messaging, and social media has created new challenges for applying human relations principles, but it has also created new opportunities for those who understand how to adapt timeless wisdom to modern formats. One of the most significant challenges I observe in modern communication is the tendency for people to become more aggressive and argumentative when they're communicating through screens rather than face-to-face. The absence of physical presence, body language, and vocal tone seems to make people forget that there's a real human being on the other side of their message. I've seen email exchanges escalate into bitter conflicts that could have been resolved with a simple phone conversation or face-to-face meeting. When people can't see the immediate emotional impact of their words, they often become careless with their language in ways that create unnecessary hurt and defensiveness. The principles I developed for avoiding arguments and showing respect for others' opinions become even more critical in digital communication. When you're writing an email that challenges someone's position or disagrees with their approach, you must be even more careful to begin in a friendly way and acknowledge their perspective before presenting your own, instead of writing your proposal. Won't work because, try, I appreciate the thought you've put into this proposal. I have some concerns about implementation that I'd like to discuss with you. The extra effort to show respect and maintain warmth in written communication pays enormous dividends in preserving relationships and achieving your goals. Social media has created an entirely new arena for arguments and disagreements, one where the principles of human relations are often completely ignored. I observe people engaging in public debates with strangers, trying to win arguments with people they'll never meet, and expressing opinions in ways that seem designed to create maximum conflict rather than understanding the challenge principle. I developed appealing to people's better nature rather than attacking their current position becomes particularly important in online environments. Instead of trying to prove someone wrong in a public forum, what if you challenged them to help you understand their perspective better? Instead of engaging in public arguments, what if you invited private conversations where you could explore different viewpoints without the pressure of performing for an audience? One of the most powerful applications of my principles in the modern world involves learning to use questions effectively in digital communication. The Socratic method I adapted from ancient philosophers works beautifully in email and text conversations, where you have time to craft thoughtful questions that help people explore their own thinking, instead of sending an email that says this strategy is flawed. You might write, I'm curious about how you see this strategy addressing the challenges we discussed last week. What outcomes are you hoping to achieve? This approach invites collaboration rather than triggering defensiveness. The principle of making people feel important becomes even more crucial in our modern work environment, where people often feel like small cogs in large machines, where personal recognition is rare, and where technology can make interactions feel impersonal and transactional. A simple email that acknowledges someone's expertise. I value your insight on this because of your experience with similar projects can have tremendous impact on their willingness to consider your suggestions and work collaboratively with you. The dramatization principle I developed has found new expression in our visual, media-rich communication environment. Instead of just describing abstract concepts in emails or presentations, modern communicators can use images, videos, and interactive demonstrations to make their ideas come alive in ways that weren't possible in my era. But the same fundamental insight applies. People are moved more by concrete, vivid experiences than by abstract arguments. Whether you're using a PowerPoint slide or a handwritten note, the goal is to help people see and feel the truth of your perspective rather than just understand it intellectually. Perhaps most importantly, the modern world has created unprecedented opportunities for the kind of personal, authentic communication that builds trust and understanding. While technology can make interactions feel impersonal, it can also enable more frequent, more intimate communication than was ever possible before. A thoughtful text message checking in on someone's project, an email that acknowledges their contribution to a successful outcome, a video call that allows face-to-face conversation across great distances. These modern tools can actually enhance the application of human relations principles when used with wisdom and intentionality. The key insight for modern application of these principles is that the medium of communication matters less than the spirit in which you approach the other person. Whether you're having a face-to-face conversation, writing an email, posting on social media, or sending a text message, the fundamental questions remain the same. Am I approaching this person with genuine respect for their perspective? Am I making them feel important and valued? Am I focusing on our shared goals rather than our surface disagreements? The principles that transformed my relationships and career in the early 20th century can transform your relationships and success today, but only if you're willing to apply them consistently across all your communication channels and methods. The technology may be new, but the human heart remains unchanged. Throughout my years of teaching these principles, I've been privileged to witness remarkable transformations in people who learned to approach disagreements as opportunities for connection rather than contests to be won. These stories continue to inspire me and demonstrate the profound impact that changing your approach to arguments can have on every aspect of your life. One of the most dramatic transformations I witnessed involved a salesman named William who attended my course in Detroit. William was technically excellent at his job. He knew his products inside and out, understood his customers' businesses, and could present compelling logical arguments for why people should buy from him. Yet his sales numbers were consistently disappointing, and he couldn't understand why less knowledgeable competitors were outselling him. During our first session together, William described a typical sales call where he had won every argument with a potential customer but lost the sale. He had proven that his product was superior, demonstrated that his prices were competitive, and logically refuted every objection the customer raised. "I was absolutely right about everything," he told me with frustration, "but they bought from my competitor anyway." As William role-played his sales approach with other class members, the problem became immediately apparent. He was treating every customer concern as an argument to be won rather than an opportunity to understand what the customer really needed. When a customer expressed hesitation about price, William would launch into a detailed comparison proving his prices were reasonable. When they questioned a product feature, he would overwhelm them with technical evidence of its superiority. William was so focused on being right that he never discovered what would actually motivate someone to buy from him. He was winning arguments and losing relationships with every interaction. Challenged William to try a completely different approach with his next prospects. Instead of preparing arguments to overcome objections, I suggested he prepare questions to understand concerns. Instead of focusing on proving his products were best, I encouraged him to focus on discovering what would make his customers most successful. The transformation in William's results was almost immediate. When he stopped trying to win arguments and started trying to win understanding, his customers began opening up about their real challenges, fears, and goals. This deeper understanding allowed William to present his products not as superior alternatives to competitors, but as specific solutions to problems that mattered to each individual customer. Within 6 months, William had doubled his income and become one of the top performers in his company. More importantly, he had developed genuine relationships with his customers based on trust and mutual respect rather than intellectual domination. Another profound transformation involved a mother named Dorothy who was struggling with constant conflicts with her teenage daughter. Every conversation seemed to turn into an argument, with Dorothy trying to convince her daughter to make better choices and her daughter becoming increasingly rebellious and distant. Dorothy's natural approach was to present logical arguments about why her daughter's behavior was problematic and what she should do differently. When her daughter wanted to stay out late, Dorothy would explain the dangers and logical reasons for earlier curfews. When her daughter chose friends Dorothy didn't approve of, she would present evidence of why these relationships were harmful. The more logical and compelling Dorothy's arguments became, the more resistant her daughter became. Their relationship was deteriorating rapidly, with both of them feeling frustrated and misunderstood. When Dorothy learned about the importance of making people feel heard and respected before trying to influence them, she decided to completely change her approach. Instead of immediately presenting her concerns when her daughter wanted something, Dorothy began by asking questions to understand her daughter's perspective and acknowledging the validity of her feelings. "Help me understand why this is important to you," became Dorothy's new starting point for difficult conversations. I can see that you feel strongly about this. Tell me more about your thinking. This simple change created space for her daughter to express herself without feeling immediately judged or criticized. When the teenager felt heard and understood, she became much more open to considering her mother's concerns and working together on solutions that honored both of their needs. Their relationship transformed from constant conflict to genuine collaboration, with both mother and daughter feeling respected and valued in their interactions. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation I witnessed involved a department manager named Charles, who was known throughout his company for his brilliant analytical mind and his ability to identify flaws in any proposal or strategy. Charles prided himself on his critical thinking skills and believed that his role was to prevent mistakes by pointing out problems with other people's ideas. While Charles was technically valuable to his organization, he had developed a reputation that made people reluctant to share ideas with him or include him in creative discussions. His colleagues knew that bringing an idea to Charles meant having it thoroughly criticized and potentially dismantled. Even when the criticism was accurate and helpful, Charles was puzzled by his colleagues' reluctance to work with him. "I'm trying to help them avoid mistakes," he told me. "Why would they resist getting valuable feedback?" I helped Charles understand that the way he delivered his insights was undermining their value. When you tell someone that their idea is flawed, even when you're absolutely correct, you're attacking their creativity and judgment in addition to providing information. I suggested that Charles experiment with presenting his analytical insights as collaborative improvements rather than critical evaluations. Instead of saying this approach has 3 major problems, he could say, "I see some interesting possibilities. Here what if we explored some ways to strengthen it further?" Instead of pointing out flaws, Charles learned to build on the positive elements of ideas while helping people discover potential improvements themselves through thoughtful questions. The change in how his colleagues responded to him was dramatic. People who had previously avoided seeking his input began actively requesting his perspective on their projects. His analytical skills became a valuable resource that people wanted to access rather than a critical evaluation they wanted to avoid. These transformation stories taught me that the principles of human relations aren't just techniques for handling difficult situations. They're a complete approach to living that can transform every relationship and interaction in your life. When you learn to approach disagreements with curiosity rather than judgment, to seek understanding before seeking to be understood, and to make others feel valued rather than diminished, you don't just become more persuasive, become the kind of person others genuinely want to be around. The principles I've shared with you will remain nothing more than interesting ideas, unless you begin practicing them in your daily interactions immediately and consistently. Transformation doesn't happen through understanding alone. It happens through deliberate, repeated application of new approaches until they become natural and automatic. I learned this lesson early in my own development when I first discovered Benjamin Franklin's techniques for diplomatic disagreement. I was excited by the insights and convinced they would improve my relationships and effectiveness. But when I tried to apply them in real conversations, I found myself falling back into old patterns of direct contradiction and argumentative responses. The problem wasn't that the techniques didn't work. It was that I hadn't practiced them enough to make them feel natural and accessible under pressure. When someone challenged my ideas or criticized my approach, my emotional reactions would override my intellectual understanding, and I would respond defensively rather than diplomatically. This experience taught me that developing new communication habits requires the same kind of deliberate practice that developing any other skill requires. You must start with simple situations and gradually work your way up to more challenging interactions. I recommend beginning your practice with low-stakes conversations where you can experiment with these techniques without significant consequences. Try the Franklin approach of beginning disagreements with "I may be wrong, but ... In casual discussions with family members or friends, practice asking Socratic questions instead of making direct statements when you're helping someone think through a decision. Pay particular attention to your emotional state during these practice sessions. Notice when you feel the urge to prove someone wrong or correct their thinking. This is the moment when your choice of response will determine whether you create connection or conflict. One of the most valuable practices I developed was what I call the daily reflection review. Each evening, I would think back through my interactions that day and identify moments when I had handled disagreements well and moments when I had fallen back into argumentative patterns. For the successful interactions, I would analyze what specific techniques I had used and how the other person had responded. This helped me understand which approaches worked best in different situations and with different types of people. For the interactions that had gone poorly, I would imagine how I could have handled them differently using the principles I was learning. I would literally script out alternative responses and visualize myself delivering them with warmth and respect rather than defensiveness or aggression. This reflection practice served two important purposes. It helped me learn from my mistakes without dwelling on them negatively, and it prepared me to handle similar situations more effectively in the future. Another crucial element of daily practice involves learning to pause before responding when someone disagrees with you or challenges your thinking. Most people react immediately to disagreement, which means they respond from emotion rather than wisdom. I trained myself to take a brief pause, just a few seconds before responding to any challenging statement. During this pause, I would ask myself, what outcome do I want from this interaction? Do I want to win an argument or build a relationship? Do I want to prove I'm right or find a solution that works for everyone? This simple pause became one of my most powerful tools for transforming conflict into collaboration. It gave me just enough time to choose my response, rather than simply reacting to my emotions. The key to successful practice is starting small and being patient with yourself as you develop new habits. Don't expect to master these techniques immediately, and don't be discouraged when you occasionally fall back into old patterns. Change takes time, and the most important thing is consistent effort rather than perfect execution. I suggest focusing on one principle at a time rather than trying to implement everything simultaneously. Spend a week practicing the art of beginning conversations in a friendly way, even when you're planning to disagree with someone. Then spend the following week working on asking questions instead of making statements when you want to challenge someone's thinking. This gradual approach allows you to develop genuine competence with each technique before moving on to the next one. It also prevents you from feeling overwhelmed by trying to remember multiple new approaches while you're in the middle of challenging conversations. One of the most encouraging aspects of practicing these principles is that you'll begin seeing positive results almost immediately. When you approach people with genuine curiosity rather than defensive argumentation, when you make them feel heard and respected rather than challenged and criticized, you'll notice that they become more open, more collaborative, and more willing to consider your perspective. These positive responses will reinforce your motivation to continue practicing and developing your skills. You'll begin to see that approaching disagreements with wisdom and empathy isn't just more ethical, it's more effective than argumentative approaches in achieving your actual goals. Remember that every interaction is an opportunity to practice these principles. Whether you're disagreeing with a family member about weekend plans, working through a business decision with colleagues, or handling a complaint from a customer, you can choose to approach the situation as a chance to build understanding rather than win an argument. The most successful students of these principles are those who commit to practicing them consistently in small, everyday interactions rather than waiting for major conflicts to test their skills. Master the art of diplomatic disagreement in casual conversations, and you'll be prepared to handle the most challenging conflicts with grace and effectiveness. As I reach the end of our time together, I want to share with you the most important insight I've gained from a lifetime of studying human relations and helping people transform their approach to conflict and disagreement. The goal was never really about winning arguments. It was always about winning people. Throughout my career, I met countless individuals who were brilliant, logical, and technically correct in their arguments, yet they struggled to influence others and build meaningful relationships. I also met people who might not have been the smartest person in the room, but who had an extraordinary ability to connect with others, inspire cooperation, and create positive change in the world around them. The difference between these two groups wasn't intelligence, education, or expertise. The difference was their fundamental approach to other human beings. The successful influencers understood something that the brilliant arguers missed. People don't change their minds because they've been proven wrong. They change their minds because they feel understood, respected, and valued by the person suggesting the change. This insight transformed not only my professional effectiveness, but my entire experience of life. When I stopped trying to prove how smart I was and started trying to understand how others felt, my relationships deepened. When I stopped focusing on being right and started focusing on being helpful, my influence expanded. When I stopped seeing disagreement as a threat to my ego and started seeing it as an opportunity to learn, my world became infinitely richer and more interesting. The principles I've shared with you: avoiding unnecessary arguments, respecting others' opinions, beginning in a friendly way, admitting your mistakes, dramatizing your ideas, and challenging rather than commanding, these aren't just communication techniques. They're expressions of a fundamental philosophy about how human beings should treat each other at its core. This philosophy recognizes that every person you encounter has something valuable to offer, some insight or experience that could enrich your understanding if you're wise enough to discover it. Every disagreement is an opportunity to learn something new about the world or about yourself. Every conflict is a chance to build a bridge rather than burn one. I've seen this philosophy transform marriages that seemed hopeless, business relationships that appeared irreparably damaged, and family conflicts that had persisted for years. Not because the people involved changed their fundamental beliefs or values, but because they learned to approach their differences with curiosity rather than hostility, with respect rather than contempt. The ripple effects of this transformation extend far beyond your immediate relationships. When you model genuine respect for others' perspectives, you inspire others to do the same. When you demonstrate that it's possible to disagree without being disagreeable, you give others permission to be vulnerable and authentic in their interactions with you. Your children will learn from watching how you handle disagreement with your spouse. Your colleagues will adopt your approach to collaborative problem solving. Your friends will feel safer being honest with you when they know that disagreement won't damage your relationship. In this way, the principles you practice in your personal interactions contribute to creating a more civil, more collaborative, and more compassionate world. Every time you choose understanding over argument, connection over conflict, you're making a small but meaningful contribution to the kind of society we all want to live in. As you begin implementing these principles, remember that mastery comes through practice, not perfection. You will have conversations that don't go as well as you hoped. You will catch yourself falling back into argumentative patterns. You will sometimes let your ego override your wisdom. This is normal and expected. It's part of the learning process, not a sign of failure. What matters is your commitment to growth and your willingness to keep trying. Each interaction is a new opportunity to apply what you've learned. Each mistake is a chance to understand yourself better and develop greater skill. I challenge you to begin this transformation today, in your very next conversation. When someone disagrees with you or challenges your thinking, remember that this is not a test of your intelligence or worth as a person. It's an opportunity to demonstrate your wisdom and character. Ask yourself, how can I make this person feel heard and respected while still expressing my own perspective? How can I turn this disagreement into a collaboration? How can I learn something valuable from this interaction while also sharing what I have to offer? The principles I've shared with you have the power to transform your relationships, accelerate your career, strengthen your family bonds, and increase your influence in every area of your life. But only if you have the courage to apply them consistently, even when your ego wants to fight, even when you're certain you're right, even when others aren't extending the same courtesy to you. This is my final challenge to you. Prove to yourself and to the world that it's possible to achieve your goals while treating others with dignity and respect. Show others that strength and kindness aren't opposites, they're partners. Demonstrate that you can be both confident in your convictions and humble enough to learn from those who disagree with you. The world needs more people who understand that winning arguments is far less important than winning hearts, that being right is far less valuable than being effective, and that the greatest victory in any conflict is helping everyone involved feel like they've gained something meaningful from the interaction. You now possess the knowledge to become one of those people. The only question that remains is whether you'll have the wisdom and courage to put this knowledge into practice. I believe you will, and I'm honored to have shared this journey of discovery with you.